The Galactic Military Academy stood at the heart of the Confederation's military might, a sprawling complex of gleaming towers and advanced technologies, each more sophisticated than the last. Across its massive training fields, cadets from dozens of races honed their skills, preparing to face the unknown dangers of the universe. Yet when the Terran cadets arrived, it became immediately clear that the Academy had underestimated them. Commander Vex Talon, an esteemed instructor and veteran strategist, paced anxiously in his office. The Terran cadets were to be a part of the exchange program, a decision he had initially questioned. His people, the Varelians, had always prided themselves on their advanced technology and centuries of military tradition. To bring in humans, wild, untamed, and from a world of near-constant conflict, seemed reckless. In fact, Vex had heard the rumors, the whispers across the galaxy. Deathworlders, they'd been called, a species that thrived in conditions that would break any other race. When the Terran shuttle landed, Vex's first impression was one of skepticism. The humans stepped out, their faces tense, eyes sharp. Nothing extraordinary about them at first glance. It was the next moment that struck him. A Varelian officer, attempting to make an impression with a standard military greeting, extended his hand toward a human cadet. The Terran didn't hesitate. He clasped the officer's hand in a vice-like grip, offering a slight, knowing smile as if he had anticipated the greeting perfectly, but with a sense of confidence that caught everyone off guard. In the following days, it was clear that these humans were not like any of the other cadets. Unlike the Varelians, who relied on precision and technologically advanced warfare, or the Barithians, who specialized in deep strategy and manipulation of terrain, the Terrans were raw, their tactics almost chaotic. Yet it worked. They adapted swiftly to the Academy's simulations, a feature that was simply unheard of. Their planet had shaped them into survivors, fighters not just by instinct, but by necessity. A flash of memory came to Vex. Stories from his youth of Earth, a place torn by constant wars and unrelenting hardship. The Academy's first combat simulation was a perfect example of the Terrans' ingenuity. The cadets, teamed with Varelian officers, were thrown into a hostile mock battle against robotic enemies designed to simulate the most dangerous forces in the galaxy. As the battle raged on, the Varelians, for all their superior tech, were slowly outmaneuvered. Their reliance on advanced weaponry and tactical algorithms failed them in the face of the humans' improvisation. They used the environment to their advantage, turning seemingly insignificant pieces of debris into tools of war, adapting on the fly in ways that even the most seasoned combatants couldn't predict. Vex observed from the sidelines, his mind racing. How had they done this? It wasn't just their quick thinking, it was their ability to adapt to the ever-shifting dynamics of combat. Varelians, with all their training, stuck to their rigid doctrines, their plans carefully laid out and executed. The humans, on the other hand, had no set playbook. Their approach was fluid, like water finding its way through cracks in the stone. And that, Vex realized, was a form of brilliance he hadn't fully appreciated. The human cadets communicated with each other in a manner that baffled their alien counterparts. They didn't rely solely on sophisticated technology for communication, but instead used gestures, facial expressions, and, most notably, an almost instinctual understanding of one another's intentions. They seemed to anticipate each other's next moves, operating as if their minds were synchronized in a way that transcended words or technology. By the time the simulation ended, the Varelian squadron had suffered a staggering defeat. Yet, to Vex's surprise, the human cadets were not reveling in their victory. They were calm, almost introspective, as if they had already moved beyond the battle. One of them, Cadet Marcus, approached Vex after the simulation, his expression unreadable. "Sir," Marcus said, "your team performed well. We've got a lot to learn from you. Vex raised an eyebrow. And what exactly did you learn from us? Marcus's smile was faint but meaningful. Not to rely so much on tech, I think. Sometimes you have to just roll with the punches, make do with what's around you. His words struck Vex deeply, reverberating in his mind like an echo in a vast chamber. This was not the cocky bravado Vex had expected from the humans. Instead, it was a recognition of something deeper, something that transcended pride or arrogance. The Terrans, for all their unrefined methods, had a wisdom about them that the Academy had not anticipated. They didn't just react, they understood the value of flexibility, of improvisation. This was a new kind of warfare, a kind that didn't simply rely on brute force or technological superiority, but on the ability to survive, to thrive, and to adapt no matter the circumstances. By the end of the week, the atmosphere within the Academy had shifted. Where once there was skepticism about the humans, there was now curiosity. Some of the older cadets were even beginning to ask questions about their methods, eager to learn more. And as Vex reviewed the performance data from the simulations, it became clear. The humans' unconventional approach had provided valuable insights into areas of combat the Academy had neglected. Their survival strategies were proving to be more than just wild stabs in the dark. They were calculated, instinctual, and deeply rooted in their evolution as a species born from a death world. Vex sat back in his chair, staring out the window, at the distant stars. The Terrans had brought something unexpected to the Galactic Military Academy, something that might just change everything. And in the back of his mind, a question lingered. How had a species from such a harsh, unforgiving world evolved such sophisticated tactics? What secrets lay beneath the surface of their history? The answers, Vex realized, were not just in the training halls of the Academy, but in the very essence of humanity itself. The following weeks at the Galactic Military Academy were nothing short of transformative for both the cadets and their instructors. The Terran cadets, who had initially been seen as a curiosity, had now begun to command attention for entirely different reasons. The Academy's instructors, once dismissive of their methods, now watched in awe as the humans, still outsiders to the grand traditions of galactic military practices, brought an innovative edge to every exercise, every battle simulation, every task. Commander Vex Talon, who had quietly monitored the humans from the beginning, couldn't shake off the increasing unease within him. The Terrans weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Their approach was unorthodox, a fusion of instinct, creativity, and raw survivalism. What the Academy had initially dismissed as primitive, they now recognized as a brilliant tactic of necessity, an ingenuity honed by millennia of struggle. He'd watched them in the obstacle courses where precision and finesse had been the norm. The Virelian cadets, with their technological enhancements and carefully planned strategies, had excelled as expected. Yet when the Terrans entered the course, they didn't follow the standard protocols. Instead, they took what they had and made it their own. Rather than carefully measuring their every step, they moved with a ferocity and abandon that could only come from a life spent fighting for survival. They built tools out of anything they could find, scavenging old debris, using their environment as an extension of their body, exploiting the smallest weaknesses in their surroundings. It was in these moments that Vex's perception began to shift. The humans weren't just trained soldiers, they were survivors, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, Vex watched as a Terran named Cadet Elena was put through a combat exercise designed to test the cadets' ability to work as a team. The scenario involved a heavily armored mock enemy that was virtually invincible to anything but the most advanced weaponry. The other cadets, including some of the best and brightest from across the galaxy, took to the simulation with all their technological prowess, but they failed to break through the mock enemy's defenses. The weapons they used, laser cannons, energy-based projectiles, bounced harmlessly off the enemy's shield. Elena, however, wasn't fazed. She stood still for a moment, surveying the environment. Then, with a single motion, she grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it toward the enemy's weak point. The rock didn't break the shield, but it distracted the mock enemy long enough for her to slip around it and find an opening. She wasn't relying on advanced tech. She was using her surroundings, her quick thinking, and her ability to improvise. Her team followed her lead, and within minutes, they had not only breached the enemy's defenses, but turned the simulation around. The cadets, who had spent years honing their combat skills, were left speechless. Vex couldn't ignore the stark contrast between the Terrans' methods and the rest of the cadets. Their approach to problem-solving was far more pragmatic, driven by years of living on a death world, a planet where only the most adaptable survived. The Terrans didn't need complex strategies to succeed. They had learned to make do with what they had, to find unconventional solutions that others overlooked. Their thinking wasn't confined by tradition, it was shaped by survival, shaped by conflict. It wasn't just in combat simulations that the Terrans stood out. In the classroom, where other species relied on massive data networks and sophisticated algorithms, the humans didn't just memorize information, they integrated it. When faced with complex theories about energy systems or battlefield strategies, the Terrans didn't simply follow what was taught. They critiqued it, adapted it, and added to it. Elena, again, was the one to ask the questions that no one had and thought to ask. She would challenge the assumption that certain tactics were always the best, arguing instead that flexibility and adaptability in real-time combat could often be more effective than rigid planning. She spoke about the lessons learned from their Earth wars, where innovation in the heat of battle often led to victory, even against overwhelming odds. In small group discussions, the human cadets formed their own tight-knit team. The camaraderie among them was immediate and intense, forged by their shared experiences. There was no hesitation in their bond, no pretense of superiority or alien cultural differences. It was raw and real, a connection rooted in understanding, not just mutual respect. Where the other species might be focused on their own advancement, the humans were focused on working together. They shared their knowledge freely, exchanging techniques and tactics as if their collective success was more important than any individual glory. It was, in many ways, the embodiment of the human spirit. United, driven, and relentlessly determined. But it was not without consequences. This new, unorthodox approach was both welcomed and feared. The Academy's more traditional instructors were unsettled by the humans' ability to disrupt established patterns. Some of the senior cadets, too, began to grow wary. They'd trained their entire lives to be part of an elite military force, and here came these humans, untrained, unpolished, and suddenly they were outshining them. One evening, after a particularly tense training session, Vex overheard a conversation between two senior cadets, a Barithian and a Zorvian, who were seated in the Academy's mess hall. "This can't go on," the Barithian said, his voice low. "They're a disruption. What happens when everyone starts thinking this improvise and adapt nonsense is a legitimate strategy?" The Zorvian grunted, his mandibles clicking in agreement. "I've seen their training methods. They don't follow the book, and yet they still succeed. It's unnatural." "Exactly. How do we know they won't start questioning everything we've learned?" The Barithian slammed his fist against the table. "We can't let them change everything." Vex, who had been listening from a distance, felt his stomach tighten. He had heard whispers of discontent from other corners of the Academy as well. While many of the instructors were intrigued by the humans' methods, a few were deeply resistant. The idea that a species from such a harsh environment could teach them something so fundamental about adaptability and survival was a bitter pill to swallow. It wasn't just about the Terrans being good. It was about them being different. The human success was an affront to everything the Academy stood for. The notion of chaos, of doing things without a clear blueprint, was foreign to the structured minds of the Academy. And yet, in his quiet moments, Vex couldn't deny it. The human's way was powerful, it was raw, it was unexpected, it was real. As the days passed, Vex found himself thinking more and more about the Terrans, about how their ingenuity didn't come from studying ancient texts or refining theoretical models, but from a place deeper than that. They had learned to survive, to fight and to adapt, not because they had the best technology or the most advanced tactics, but because they had learned that life, at its core, was about finding a way through, no matter the odds. And that made them more dangerous than any technology or doctrine the Academy could provide. The air was thick with anticipation as the cadets stood in formation on the vast metallic expanse of the simulation battlefield. The Galactic Military Academy had spared no expense in constructing this war game, designed to push the limits of its brightest students. The stakes were high. This exercise wasn't just a simulation. It was a test of everything the cadets had learned, everything they had been trained to do, all culminating in one defining moment. It was a crucible, and the Terrans were about to enter it. Commander Vex Talon watched from the observation tower, his arms crossed, eyes focused. The holographic battlefield before him glimmered, an eerily realistic replica of a war-torn planet. The objective was simple. Each team had to destroy the other's command center, but the path to victory would be anything but straightforward. The Virelian cadets, veterans of countless simulations, had the superior technology. They were equipped with high-powered energy weapons, shields, and drones. The Borithians had their tactical mindsets, and the Zorvians relied on their organic ability to manipulate terrain. The Terrans? They were the wild cards, untested in such a high-stakes simulation, and in Vex's mind, utterly unprepared for what lay ahead. The simulation began, and immediately the cadets sprang into action. The Virelians unleashed their drones, a swarm of sleek, metallic warriors darting through the battlefield like a well-oiled machine. Their energy cannons hummed with deadly precision as they sought out targets, their movements calculated and deliberate. The Borithians took a different approach, using their psychic abilities to distort the terrain, creating deep ravines and impassable barriers for the enemy. The Zorvians, with their agile, organic nature, weaved through the chaos, creating ambush points that left the other cadets scrambling. And then the Terrans, human cadets, barely a dozen in number, moved with a confidence that surprised everyone. They weren't just fighting, they were surviving. The Academy had expected them to falter under the weight of the superior technologies, arrayed against them. But what they saw instead was a tenacity and adaptability that bordered on the absurd. The Terrans didn't rely on advanced tech to shield themselves from the oncoming onslaught. Instead, they took cover behind rocks and debris, using the environment to their advantage in ways no one had anticipated. The other cadets were focused on eliminating their opponents with surgical precision. But the humans saw the battle in a different light. It wasn't about precision, it was about improvisation. It was about finding whatever they could in the heat of the moment and turning it into a weapon. Cadet Elena, the same one who had thrown a rock in the earlier simulation, took charge. She motioned for her team to move forward, her face set with determination. She had no intention of simply surviving this battle. No, she intended to win. With her team at her back, she advanced on the enemy's flank, out of sight from the Virelian. Drones, but the drones had their own algorithms, designed to detect even the slightest movement. A Virelian commander's voice crackled over the comms. "All units, focus fire on the humans. They're in the open." For a moment, the entire battlefield held its breath. The drones honed in on the Terrans, their energy cannons charging. But instead of fleeing or hiding, Elena did something no one expected. She charged. She led her team through a hail of laser fire, weaving through the attacks with an audacity that stunned everyone watching. The other cadets, all trained to avoid such a reckless strategy, froze for just a second, just long enough for Elena's squad to reach cover. They didn't just survive, they engaged the enemy head-on, forcing the drones into an unpredictable pattern that disrupted their firing. Solutions. This was no longer just a simulation. This was something else entirely. The Terrans were creating chaos, pushing the battlefield into an entirely new paradigm. Their tactics were unsophisticated, but effective. They weren't focused on overpowering their opponents with technology. Instead, they overwhelmed them with sheer force of will, turning every corner into a trap, every weakness into an advantage. Vex watched in disbelief as the Terrans pushed the Virelians back, the tide of the battle shifting with every passing second. They weren't better equipped, and they weren't more skilled in the traditional sense. But their creativity, born of their harsh, unpredictable world, was something that the Academy hadn't prepared for. The other cadets relied on their advanced weaponry, their superior intellect, and their centuries of experience. But the humans, they used what they had, and that was enough. Elena's squad, under her guidance, found a breach in the Virelian defense line, using a simple grenade launcher to take down an enemy drone. It wasn't the most efficient weapon, but it was one they had, and it worked. The Virelians scrambled to adapt, their military tactics failing them as they faced the humans' relentless ingenuity. One by one, the drones were disabled. The command center was surrounded, and the Virelians were left with no choice but to retreat. The battlefield was littered with wreckage, the remnants of a simulation that had taken a turn no one had expected. The Terrans had not just survived, they had reshaped the entire exercise to fit their unconventional tactics. The Virelians were defeated, not because they were outnumbered or outgunned, but because they had underestimated the Terran spirit. The simulation ended, and a silence fell over the battlefield. The Terrans stood tall, their faces covered in dirt, their armor scuffed, but their expressions were full of pride. Their victory wasn't about proving they were better. It was about proving that no matter what the galaxy threw at them, they would always find a way. Vex Talon stood at the observation deck, his arms folded, deep in thought. He had watched the entire simulation unfold, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the Academy's understanding of warfare had just shifted. The Terrans had demonstrated that heart, ingenuity, and the will to survive could outmatch the most advanced technology. They had turned the tide of battle with nothing but the raw power of their minds and their ability to adapt on the fly. It was a revelation. As the Terrans gathered around their victory point, laughing and high-fiving each other in the light-hearted way that only humans could, Vex couldn't help but feel the weight of the question that loomed over him. Could the galaxy's military forces adapt to this new paradigm? Or would they cling to the traditional doctrines that had served them so well for so long? He knew the answer was no longer simple. The galaxy would have to evolve, just as the humans had, but for the first time in his career, Vex wasn't sure what that evolution would look like. The battle simulation had ended hours ago, yet the echoes of that combat still reverberated through the halls of the Galactic Military Academy. The cadets had retreated to their barracks, but the faculty remained in the command center, gathered around a table littered with holographic reports and data projections. The Terrans had upended everything. Their unconventional tactics, their resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, had shaken the very foundations of the Academy's teachings. It was impossible to ignore. Commander Vex Talon stood at the far end of the room, his hands clasped behind his back as he observed the ongoing debate. The other instructors, a mix of Virelian, Borithian, and Zorvian strategists, were discussing the simulation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The human cadets had defied all expectations, their victory a testament to their ability to improvise, to adapt, and to persevere. Yet beneath the surface of their success, a quiet fear lingered among the Academy's staff. "Is this how we want our cadets to think?" asked Captain Aaron of the Varelians, his tone sharp. His species had long prided itself on its technological superiority, and the Terrans' reliance on instinct rather than precision struck him as a challenge to everything he knew. "Their entire approach goes against everything we've taught them. Maybe it's time we rethink what we've taught," countered Professor Elora, a seasoned Borithian strategist who had watched the Terrans work with an increasing sense of respect. The Terrans, they didn't just use their technology. They used their minds. They adapted. Isn't that what we've always said we value? The ability to think on the fly? The room fell into silence as her words hung in the air. The Zorvian, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up, his voice low but full of weight. "It's not just their minds, it's their unity. Did you notice how they functioned as a single unit, not just individuals? They didn't wait for instructions. They made decisions together. In our culture, that's considered unorthodox. We're taught to rely on our individual strength, not to act as a collective." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Commander Vex remained silent. He had been listening carefully, his sharp mind processing the events of the day. The Terran success wasn't a fluke, it was the product of their deeply ingrained survival instincts. The question wasn't whether their methods worked. The question was whether the Academy was ready to integrate them into its philosophy. "How much of this can we afford to adopt?" Captain Aaron asked, his voice tinged with reluctance. "If we embrace their approach, we risk losing the structure that's kept us at the top of the galaxy. We might end up like them." Vex could sense the unease in the room. The other instructors were afraid, not just of the Terrans' tactics, but of what their success might mean for the future. The traditional methods they had relied on for centuries were now being questioned, and the stability of their beliefs was being shaken to its core. The Terrans' methods, adaptability, resilience, and unity, weren't just military tactics. They were a philosophy, a worldview shaped by the harshness of their home planet. On Earth, survival wasn't guaranteed, and every victory had to be earned, no matter the odds. The humans fought for their lives not just because they had to, but because they had learned that survival depended on working together, adapting to each situation, and never giving up, even when failure seemed inevitable. Vex knew this all too well. His mind returned to the moments he had witnessed the humans in action, their seamless coordination in battle, their uncanny ability to read each other without words. It was a synergy that no technology could replicate, no doctrine could teach. It was born of something far deeper, something ingrained in their very DNA, and it was something the Academy had never truly accounted for. As the instructors continued to debate, Vex's thoughts drifted back to his own experiences. He had been raised on the ideals of precision and calculated action. In the Varelian military, failure was not an option. They were taught to plan every move, every step. But the Terrans didn't plan in the way Vex had been taught. They felt their way through battle, relying on gut instincts, on what the moment required. They didn't hesitate. They didn't question. They simply acted. It was messy, chaotic even, but it worked, and that frightened him. "Perhaps it's not about adopting everything they do," Professor Elora suggested, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "But we need to understand why it works, why their approach is effective. This could be the key to evolving our training, evolving our very understanding of what makes a soldier." Vex felt the weight of her words. The Academy's core values had been tested, and now they had to decide whether to adapt or hold on to the old ways. The Terrans had shown them something vital, that in the chaos of battle, adaptability, resilience, and unity weren't just virtues. They were necessities. As Vex looked around the room at his colleagues, he knew this was a turning point. The Academy could no longer afford to remain static, clinging to its traditional methods. They had to change. They had to evolve. And the Terrans, for all their perceived flaws, had proven that change was not just possible, it was essential. The debate continued long into the night, but Vex's mind was already made up. The Academy would integrate the Terrans' principles into its core teachings. It was the only way forward. The final days of the semester arrived like the closing of a chapter, but for Commander Vex Talon and the entire Galactic Military Academy, it was more like the beginning of a new era. The Terran cadets, once regarded as the underdogs of the program, had not only survived, they had transformed the Academy's very fabric. The story of their journey, from skepticism and doubt to full recognition and respect, had become a reflection of humanity's broader influence on the galaxy. Vex had watched it all unfold, each moment more surprising than the last. The Terrans, who had once been seen as primitive by some and disruptive by others, had shown the galaxy that their greatest strength was not in their technology, not in their superior weaponry, but in their relentless adaptability and unyielding spirit. In every exercise, every challenge, the humans had used their ingenuity, their resilience, and their willingness to face the impossible with unwavering determination. What began as simple curiosity had turned into profound admiration. The once dismissed Terrans had not only earned their place alongside the galaxy's finest, but had redefined what it meant to be a soldier, a survivor, and an innovator. They had proven that true strength did not lie in advanced weaponry or perfected tactics, but in the ability to adapt, to learn, and to overcome. Through their victories, they had shown that the true power of a warrior lay not in the weapons they wielded, but in their will to fight and their capacity to unite against the odds. Vex had always believed that warfare was about precision, about control, about order. The Terrans had shattered that belief. They had taught him that sometimes the best strategy was not the one that followed the book, but the one that was written in the heat of battle, forged from the chaos of the moment. It was this flexibility that made them formidable, and as Vex watched them interact with their fellow cadets, it became clear that their influence was no longer confined to the training halls of the Academy. The Terrans had altered the very nature of what it meant to fight, to live, to survive, and to thrive. As the final exhibition of the semester approached, the entire Academy stood as a witness to this change. The Terrans, now regarded as equals, prepared to showcase the unique contributions they had made to the Academy's curriculum. Their approach had become integrated into the Academy's teachings, influencing the strategies and philosophies of every species present. No longer were they outsiders. They were now a vital part of the collective knowledge, an essential thread in the fabric of the Academy's future. The exhibition was a grand event, a culmination of all the cadets' hard work, but it was also a reflection of the Academy's evolution. It was a moment of reckoning, a demonstration of how far they had come, not just as individuals, but as a united force. The Terrans had led the way, pushing boundaries, questioning norms, and challenging the very essence of what it meant to be a soldier in the galaxy. And in doing so, they had inspired a revolution in thought, a revolution that had spread beyond the Academy's walls, sparking a galaxy-wide discussion about the future of warfare and interspecies cooperation. The question that lingered, however, was not about the Terrans' victory. That was clear. The question was whether this was the beginning of a new era in interspecies collaboration, or whether the galaxy would retreat back into its old ways, clinging to the safety of tradition and familiar methods. The Terrans had shown that adaptability, unity and resilience were not just values to be admired, they were the future. But would the galaxy be ready to embrace them? As the cadets of every species took their places in the Grand Hall, a sense of anticipation filled the air. The Terrans were no longer the unknown variable. They were now a symbol of what the galaxy could become. The exhibition showcased the very best of what the Academy had learned, and it was clear that the lessons of the Terrans would be carried forward, shaping the future of military strategy and interspecies relations for years to come. And yet, as Vex watched the Terran cadets interact with their peers, he couldn't help but wonder, would the galaxy truly change, or would this just be a fleeting moment in the annals of history? The Terrans had already proven their worth, but the real test lay ahead. Would the lessons they had taught be remembered, or would they fade, overshadowed by the pressures of old alliances and entrenched doctrines? The galaxy was at a crossroads, and the Terrans had thrown open the doors to a future that was uncertain, yet full of potential. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain. The Terrans had already begun to carve their place in the stars. And in the heart of the Galactic Military Academy, Vex Talon stood quietly, reflecting on the remarkable journey of the humans. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew this. The Terrans had proven that they could adapt to anything. And maybe, just maybe, the rest of the galaxy could learn to do the same.